What is your standard, and are you being consistent? This is Thoughtful Beetle, and those are the two things that I've tried to keep in mind, and that I'd also like you to try to keep in mind when thinking about both abortion and about COVID-19 vaccine mandates. Two very contentious issues, I know, and two issues that you've probably been hearing a lot about in the news recently. But here, I'd like to make a case for why I am both pro-choice and pro-COVID-19 vaccine mandates, because I see them boiling down to a similar standard, and I see supporting both as being consistent. Now, before we get too far into that, I think there's something we need to establish first, and that's the fact that rights can and do come into conflict with each other. And when that happens, we need to consider whose rights we curtail and why. And this is often an uncomfortable thing to think about because we tend to think of rights as being inviolable. But the fact of the matter is that whatever right you may pick, the right to life, liberty, the pursuit of happiness, the right to freedom of speech, the right to bear arms, any of those can and should be curtailed in the correct circumstances if they conflict with the rights of other people. So keeping that in mind, why am I pro-choice? And there's a lot of really valid and important arguments regarding abortion that I'm not even going to be discussing here. Things like, when is the fetus a person? What about cases of rape and incest? Or even the idea, is abortion morally right or wrong? I'm not going to be dealing with any of those, even though they are very important. Instead, for my argument, we could actually grant that the fetus is a person, that we can and should blame the pregnant person for being pregnant in the first place, that we shouldn't consider any other mitigating circumstances like rape or incest, and also we could say that abortion is, in fact, morally wrong. Now, I personally don't believe any of those things are true, but my argument doesn't rest on those, because my argument gets to what I think is the actual core issue that needs to be addressed when it comes to abortion. And that is, should the government be able to force someone who is pregnant to give birth against their will? Which the government would do if it made abortion illegal or inaccessible. And my answer is no. I don't think the government should be able to force someone who is pregnant to give birth against their will. And that's because we have two rights that are coming into conflict here. The right of the pregnant person to bodily autonomy and the right of the fetus to life. And in my view, in the case of pregnancy, I think the right to bodily autonomy wins out. If you're pro-life, you might be very strongly disagreeing with me right now. But let me illustrate the point through a hypothetical. Let's say you're driving your car and you look down to answer a text, and through your distraction, you cause a car accident. The person in the other car is quite badly injured and both of you are taken to the hospital, and it turns out the other person needs a blood transfusion in order to live. Unfortunately, the hospital doesn't have that blood available, but it turns out that you are a perfect match to the blood type of the person from the other car. In other words, they need some of your blood in order to live. But here's the thing. You decide you don't want to donate your blood. In that case, should it be legally permissible for the doctors and nurses to strap you down and take some of your blood against your will in order to save the life of the other person? Now, bear in mind, the question isn't about whether or not you should want to donate blood, but rather, should you be forced to? How do you feel about the idea of it being legal for other people to forcibly take your blood, even when you don't want them to? Does that idea make you uncomfortable, or maybe even a little outraged? It very well might. But the problem is, if your answer is no, even if that's the only way to save the other person's life, and even if I was at fault for the accident, it should not be legally permissible for them to take my blood against my will, then I don't see how you could consistently be pro-life. Because after all, giving blood is virtually painless, it's extremely safe, and there's a very low chance of complications or other side effects. Being pregnant and giving birth, on the other hand, is going to last at least several months. It's going to be extremely painful. There's a very high chance of other side effects or complications, and while low, there's a distinct possibility of you dying. In other words, being pregnant and giving birth is much more of an ordeal than giving blood is. So how could it possibly be consistent to not allow for the saving of a life through involuntary blood transfusion, but to allow for the saving of a life through involuntary pregnancy and birth? If you're pro-life, you should be in favor of some pretty extreme medical procedures, much more extreme than just giving blood, being forced upon other people who we deem to be in the wrong in order to save somebody else's life. So, to me, the right to bodily autonomy wins out in the case of pregnancies. Being pregnant and giving birth simply is too much of an ordeal and carries too much risk to force someone to do it involuntarily, even if that necessarily results in the death of the fetus. But you'll remember at the start of the video that I said I was in favor of COVID-19 vaccine mandates, which begs the question, when do I think it's okay to violate another person's bodily autonomy? Well, it's not really a cut and dried answer, but here are some general criteria. 1. Whatever procedure is being forced upon someone has to provide a very significantly disproportionate benefit to at least one other person, and preferably more. 2. The risk, pain, and emotional harm to someone must be low enough that many people would voluntarily make the choice to have the procedure done anyways, given the outcome. And 3. The procedure should tangibly benefit whoever is getting it, regardless of whether they want it or not. If we see how forcing someone to be pregnant and give birth lines up with these criteria, it doesn't do very well. Criteria 1 certainly could be met depending on how we weigh benefit, but criteria 2 really isn't, because being pregnant and giving birth has a lot of risks and a lot of potential pain and trauma. And this is all compounded by the fact that the person who's getting the abortion presumably doesn't want the outcome of having the child. And criteria 3 certainly isn't met, because if somebody doesn't want to have a child, then being forced to be pregnant and give birth provides them no benefit whatsoever. So while it is reductive and highly simplistic, my body, my choice does apply in this scenario, in my opinion. Interestingly, I've heard the same mantra, my body, my choice, being used by people who are protesting COVID-19 vaccine mandates. The idea here being that people shouldn't be forced to be vaccinated against their will. And you'll notice the idea basically boils down to the same principle, that bodily autonomy wins out against the risk to the lives of others. However, I think it's entirely consistent to be both pro-choice and pro-vaccination. So let's take a look at being vaccinated for COVID and see how it measures up to the 3 criteria we have for forcing someone to have a medical procedure. First, being vaccinated can significantly benefit multiple other people. Reducing the chance that you yourself can be a carrier reduces risks to others, and when it comes to communicable diseases, this effect can be compounded many times over. There's variability to be sure, but vaccination has a good chance of benefiting many other people, with increasing overall efficacy as more people are vaccinated. Additionally, there is negligible risk to yourself by taking the vaccine, and it isn't painful or traumatic to any meaningful degree. Based on everything we know, the chance of adverse health effects of any of the currently available COVID vaccines are essentially non-existent. And of course, the risks of contracting COVID are much greater than those of taking the vaccine. Which leads us to the last point. Receiving the vaccine tangibly benefits the recipient, even if they didn't want the vaccine in the first place. It significantly reduces your risk of death and of many other complications caused by COVID, even if it doesn't eliminate them entirely. So, how does COVID vaccination stand up to these criteria? Well, it meets all of them pretty well. And additionally, because the risks are so low and the potential benefits so high, it makes the choice easier. In this case, bodily autonomy does not win out against the benefits provided to other people, in my opinion. Overall, what's been so strange to me is seeing people who are pro-life simultaneously being anti-vaccination on the basis of bodily autonomy. And considering how low the pain and risks and potential trauma of vaccination are compared to those of giving birth, this seems wildly inconsistent. The only real way I've seen people get around this are by colossally inflating the dangers of vaccination, despite a lack of evidence supporting that view and huge amounts of evidence to the contrary. As far as I'm aware, you can't really be pro-life and simultaneously be anti-vaccination on the basis of bodily autonomy and still have a consistent standard. But I'd love to know your thoughts on these topics, especially if you think I'm wrong or if you think I'm missing something. Do you think it's consistent to be both pro-life and anti-vaccination on the basis of bodily autonomy? Do you think that bodily autonomy is an inviolable right in all cases? Do you think the government should be able to step in, and if so, when? Let me know what you think, and I'll see you next time.